911? What's the emergency?
My wife and I need an ambulance. We're bleeding.
Tell me exactly what happened.
I don't know. Someone's in the house, and the next thing I know, I wake up next to my wife and I'm bleeding.
What started as a wealthy Florida couple's argument about their daughter's expensive wedding ended with one of them fighting for their life, covered in blood. But who was the real victim that night, and why did their stories about what happened keep changing? Tonight, we're diving into a case that shocked Florida, the story of Mike and Sue Reuschel. They seemed like the perfect couple, rich, successful, living the American dream. But behind closed doors, their marriage was falling apart. And on one terrible night in February 2018, their fight turned deadly. This is the story of a husband and wife who both claimed to be the victim, but only one of them was telling the truth. To everyone on the outside, Mike and Sue Reuschel looked like the perfect couple living the American dream. They were rich, successful, and happy, or at least that's how it seemed. They lived in a beautiful home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Gainesville, Florida. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always trimmed, the driveways are long, and the gates keep the world out. Mike was a retired businessman who had done well for himself. He had 2 grown daughters from a previous marriage and was known for being smart, organized, and always in control. Sue, his second wife, was a hospice nurse. She was warm, social, and well-liked by friends and neighbors. She had 1 daughter from her own previous relationship. Together, Mike and Sue looked like the picture of stability. They traveled, went out to dinners, stayed active, and posted smiling photos online. They gave off the vibe of a couple who had life figured out. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, things were very different. Their marriage, which began in 2007, started off strong. But over time, small cracks began to show. And eventually, those cracks became deep divides. Mike liked control. He wasn't loud or aggressive in public, but he had his way of running things behind the scenes. He organized their schedules, handled the money, and even tracked Sue's workouts and diet. Sue had her own strong personality. She didn't like being told what to do, and she wasn't the type to stay quiet when something upset her. That mix of personalities became a slow-burning fuse. They argued about everything: money, family, lifestyle, and control. Sometimes those arguments spilled into texts or emails. Sometimes they turned into long silences. And sometimes they turned into shouting matches. But in public, they still smiled. They still showed up together. No one could tell what was really going on at home. Things took a serious turn in 2017 during the planning of Mike's daughter Caroline's wedding. The wedding wasn't just a big event, it became the spark that lit the fire. It was going to be a grand, expensive affair, the kind of wedding that looks like something out of a movie. Sue felt it was over the top and too expensive. She worried about the cost and about how much Mike was spending on his daughter from his previous marriage. She had always felt that Mike prioritized his first family more than he should. That feeling only got worse during the wedding planning. There were arguments, not just small disagreements, but serious fights. Sue didn't like that Mike was pouring money into the wedding, especially when she felt ignored or disrespected. She told friends that Mike would shut her out emotionally, that he only seemed to care about appearances, and Caroline's wedding was the perfect example. The wedding finally happened in November of that year, and by all accounts, it was beautiful. A huge venue, expensive dresses, and lots of guests. To outsiders, it looked like a dream, but for Mike and Sue, it was a breaking point. Not long after the wedding, there was an argument so serious that Sue ended up calling the police. She told them that she and Mike had gotten into a fight and that it had gotten physical. Mike didn't press charges, and Sue left the home for a while. She stayed at their beach condo to cool off. For a time, it looked like their marriage might be over. But like many couples who've been together for years, they tried to patch things up. They exchanged texts, talked things through, and agreed to try again. Sue moved back into the Gainesville house by early 2018. Mike told her he wanted to move forward, that they could fix things. And Sue, maybe hoping to hold on to the life they had built, agreed to give it another chance. To friends and neighbors, it looked like things were back to normal. The couple was seen out together again. The smiles returned, at least on the surface. But the truth was, nothing had really changed. The tension was still there, just hiding under a fragile layer of peace. Sue still felt Mike was controlling. Mike still believed Sue was too emotional and too focused on the past. They were both holding on to resentment, and as time passed, those feelings didn't go away. They got worse. They started arguing again, especially about Caroline. Sue felt that Mike always took his daughter's side, that he gave her money, time, and attention that should have gone into their marriage. Mike, on the other hand, felt attacked every time he tried to defend his daughter. Every conversation turned into a battlefield, and both sides came armed. By early February 2018, they were barely holding it together. The house felt tense and cold, the kind of place where you could feel the anger, even when no one was speaking. Then came the weekend that would change everything. Mike invited Sue to have a nice evening together. Dinner, drinks, a night to reconnect. Maybe he meant it. Maybe she believed him. Or maybe both of them knew it was just another attempt to pretend things were okay. They went out, they came home, and sometime after midnight, the arguing started again. That night, something happened. Something terrible. The next morning, their lives would never be the same. The police would be called, blood would be found, and the story of Mike and Sue Reuschel, the perfect Florida couple, would be shattered forever. But before we get to what happened that night, you have to understand this. Mike and Sue weren't just a couple with problems. They were two people locked in a long, bitter struggle for control, respect, and power. They smiled for the cameras. They waved at neighbors. But inside their home, a storm had been brewing for years. It started with love, then came control, then resentment, then blame, and eventually it would all explode. They came home that night hoping to reconnect. Instead, things spiraled out of control. It was just after midnight on February 3rd, 2018, when Mike Reuschel picked up the phone and dialed 911. His voice was tense but calm. He told the dispatcher something strange. He said that someone had broken into their home, that both he and his wife Sue had been stabbed, that he had woken up next to her in bed, bleeding. He said the intruder had run off into the night after he scared them away. Within minutes, emergency crews arrived at the Reuschel home, and what they found inside didn't quite match the story Mike had just told. Both Mike and Sue were injured, yes, but it was clear from the moment they entered that Sue's wounds were far more serious. She was lying in bed, barely conscious, covered in blood. Her neck had been stabbed, her abdomen was slashed open, her thumb was almost cut off. Her wrist and forearm were sliced so deep that doctors would later describe the wounds as nearly fatal. Medics rushed her to the hospital and straight into emergency surgery. They weren't sure if she was going to survive. Mike, on the other hand, had only minor injuries. Small cuts on his stomach and wrist, nothing like what Sue had endured. He said he had tried to fight off the intruder and got him hurt in the process. But the story started to fall apart the moment detectives looked around. There were no signs of a break-in, no smashed windows, no kicked-in doors. Nothing was stolen, and nothing was out of place. The security system hadn't been triggered. Even more telling, the cameras around their home hadn't recorded anyone coming or going around the time of the attack. The house was undisturbed, too quiet, too clean. It didn't look like a stranger had just burst in and violently attacked a couple in their sleep. Then came the blood patterns, stains on the wall, the bed, the carpet. Forensics experts analyzed them carefully, noting how the patterns didn't suggest a chaotic break-in or a surprise assault from an outsider. Instead, they looked like the result of a close, brutal struggle between two people. Someone had been standing over Sue, someone had stabbed her repeatedly, someone had tried to stage the scene. And then Sue woke up. After surgery, when she could finally speak, she gave a very different version of the night. She didn't say anything about a break-in. There was no mystery intruder, no stranger in the house. She told detectives that the man who stabbed her was her husband, Mike. She said they'd gotten into an argument, like they had many times before. The night started with dinner, drinks, maybe an attempt to smooth things over. But somewhere between the evening and early morning hours, things turned dark. She was in the guest bedroom, she told them, when Mike walked in holding a knife. She said he got on top of her, straddled her chest, and began stabbing. Her neck, her stomach, her hands. Anywhere she tried to shield herself, he kept cutting. She screamed. She fought back. She bled. And finally, when it was over, she was lying there, slipping in and out of consciousness. She asked him to call for help. She begged him. That's when, according to Sue, Mike told her he would, but only if she agreed to lie. He needed her to say that someone else had done it, that a masked man had broken in, stabbed them both, and disappeared. She agreed. She was desperate to live. That's the moment Mike called 911, and that's the moment he became a suspect. The 911 call was recorded, and investigators listened closely. Mike told the operator that someone had stabbed both him and his wife, that they had been asleep, that he woke up to find blood. He sounded calm. Too calm, some would later say. Not like someone who had just fought off a maniac in his home. More like someone trying to stay on script. Investigators noticed something else. Mike's wounds were shallow and oddly placed. Small cuts, more like scratches than actual stab wounds. One of the cuts even appeared self-inflicted. Meanwhile, Sue had been cut so badly that doctors said it was a miracle she survived. Her injuries were not only deep, they were in vital areas, places someone would target if they were trying to kill. As detectives pieced together the story, it became clear that Sue's version made more sense than Mike's. The lack of forced entry, the blood patterns, the security footage, the difference in injuries, it all pointed to a single truth. There was no intruder. There never had been. The attacker had been in the house all along, and he had been wearing a wedding ring. But even with all this evidence, there was still a question hanging in the air. Why? What could have pushed Mike Reuschel, a man who seemingly had it all, a beautiful home, money, status, respect, to attack his own wife in the middle of the night? What was going on behind those gated walls that no one else could see? The truth, it seemed, had been building for years. Sue's words painted a picture of a controlling, emotionally distant man who wanted things his way. Mike's daughter's lavish wedding had driven a wedge even deeper between them. Arguments about money, about family, about respect. Their marriage had become a battlefield, and on that night, it exploded into violence. What had started as a picture-perfect life was now shattered. One person was clinging to life in a hospital bed. The other was spinning a story that was already unraveling, and the police weren't buying it.
A perfect lie begins to unravel. Mike Reuschel had a story. He told it calmly and with just enough emotion to sound believable. A masked intruder had broken in, attacked him and his wife, then vanished into the night. For a moment, it seemed plausible. But detectives weren't there to trust. They were there to verify. And with every step they took, Mike's version of events started to unravel. Investigators began by doing what they always do, going back to the basics. First, was there even a way someone could have broken in? They checked doors, windows, locks, everything was intact. No pry marks, no shattered glass, no evidence that anyone had forced their way in. Even the alarm system hadn't tripped. The Reuschel home sat behind gates in one of Gainesville's safest neighborhoods, and all signs pointed to one thing. No one had entered that house except the people who lived there. Next came the security footage. The cameras around the house were clear and functional, and police pulled the recordings from the night of the attack. They expected, at the very least, to see some shadowy figure moving through the yard or driveway. But the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. No visitor, no suspicious car, no one fleeing the scene. The only people recorded entering or leaving the house that night were Mike and Sue. At that point, the intruder theory started to collapse, but the detectives still needed more, so they turned to the physical evidence. Forensic teams combed through the bedroom, documenting every drop of blood, every fingerprint, every inch of disturbed bedding. They didn't just take photos, they reconstructed the entire scene. Blood spatter analysis revealed the sequence of movement, the angle of the blows, the position of Sue when she was stabbed, where she tried to run, where she collapsed. It painted a vivid picture, one that didn't match Mike's story of waking up already wounded. Even more telling was the blood trail, or lack of one. There was no evidence that a third person had walked through the house, no stray footprints, no bloody handprints that didn't belong. And most importantly, there was no sign that Mike had been defending himself or anyone else. His wounds were clean, shallow, and almost carefully placed, nothing like the brutal, targeted injuries Sue had suffered. Still, Mike stuck to his version. At one point, he even changed his story slightly, suggesting Sue may have attacked him first. But that didn't make sense either. The forensic evidence showed Sue had defensive injuries, deep cuts on her hands and forearms, the kind that come from trying to shield yourself from a knife. If she had started the fight, those would have been the last injury she received, not the first. Her nearly severed thumb and the stab wound to her neck spoke to something far more terrifying. Someone who had been overpowered and attacked with intent to kill. The detectives didn't just rely on blood and video, they listened to the 911 call, to Sue's interviews once she regained consciousness, and eventually to Mike's own inconsistencies. He'd claimed he didn't know what had happened, then gave detailed timelines. He said he couldn't remember stabbing Sue, then admitted he'd messed up. His story shifted every time a new piece of evidence emerged. The lies weren't just unraveling, they were crumbling. It became clear to investigators that Mike hadn't just hurt his wife, he had planned to cover it up. He had tried to clean himself up, staged his own injuries, and then called 911 with a carefully rehearsed story. It wasn't a moment of panic, it was a calculated decision to make himself look like the victim. With everything laid out, the forensic evidence, the inconsistencies, the injuries, the security footage, detectives made their move. Mike Reuschel was arrested and charged with attempted murder and false imprisonment. He had gone from a respected businessman with a pristine reputation to an accused man in handcuffs. What began as a shaky, emotional phone call turned into a full-blown criminal investigation. And the evidence, every last detail, had told its own story, one that Mike couldn't explain away. Showdown in the courtroom, guilty or innocent? Once the pieces of that violent February night were in place, detectives didn't hesitate. Mike Reuschel, who had once been seen as a successful, polished businessman, was arrested and charged with attempted first-degree murder. The man who once held a respected position in Gainesville's elite was now facing decades in prison. In the months that followed, the story made headlines. What really happened behind the closed doors of that luxurious Florida home? Who was telling the truth, Mike or Sue? It all came to a head in a courtroom packed with reporters, family, and strangers holding their breath.
The prosecution's case was brutal, raw, and precise. They told the jury that Mike had snapped, not in a fit of passion, but in a cold, calculated way. He didn't want Sue to leave. He didn't want a divorce. He didn't want to lose money. So instead of letting her walk away, he tried to eliminate her. They walked the jury through the crime scene, blood smeared across the floor, the bed soaked in it, and a bent kitchen knife, proof of the force used. Forensic specialists confirmed that the wounds on Sue's body were severe. A deep gash across her throat, stabs to her stomach, hands nearly torn apart as she tried to protect herself. The knife had hit bone. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a scuffle. It was an attack with one purpose: to kill. Sue took the stand next, and the courtroom grew still. She spoke softly but clearly, describing that terrifying night. According to her, the fight started as so many of their arguments did, over money, control, and resentment. This time, the tension had boiled over during an argument about Mike's daughter's upcoming New York wedding. Sue felt left out. She and Mike had fought, but what followed was beyond anything she'd imagined. She told the jury that Mike had come at her with a knife, that he overpowered her, stabbed her, pinned her down, that he stopped only when she agreed to go along with his plan. She said he told her to lie, to say someone else had broken in and done it. He warned her that if she didn't, the police would think she was the aggressor. Scared and bleeding, she agreed. But when she was finally alone, away from Mike, in a hospital bed, she told the truth. Prosecutors emphasized that everything about the crime scene matched Sue's version of events. There was no sign of a break-in, no evidence of a third party. The knife was from their own kitchen. The security cameras had been disabled manually just before the attack. The alarm system had been disarmed. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was something much darker. Then came the defense. Mike's attorney painted a different picture. He described Sue as unstable, angry, and emotionally unpredictable. He claimed that Mike had been walking on eggshells for years. That night, they argued, as they often did, and according to Mike, Sue snapped. The defense claimed she was the one who got violent, throwing objects, swinging at him, even grabbing a knife. Mike's wounds, they said, were real too. This wasn't a one-sided assault. It was a mutual fight, and Mike had only defended himself. When Mike took the stand, he broke down in tears. He told the court he loved Sue, that he never meant to hurt her, that he didn't even know how things escalated the way they did. He said Sue had flown into a rage and came at him with the knife first. He described his injuries in vivid detail, trying to show that he too had suffered. The defense also pointed to Sue's past behavior. They brought up a handful of angry texts, a few old police reports, and tried to suggest she had a history of being volatile. But the strategy didn't hold up against the mountain of forensic evidence and Sue's own consistency under cross-examination. Then came one of the most telling moments of the trial, a message Sue had written to Mike months earlier. In it, she mentioned divorce, not for the first time, and expressed frustration at the imbalance in their relationship. She wrote about how tired she was of playing a role, of being controlled. It was clear she had been thinking about walking away. That message, prosecutors argued, was the motive. Mike didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to lose control, and he certainly didn't want to divide his wealth. The jury saw through the defense's story. They didn't believe that Sue, with life-threatening injuries and massive blood loss, had staged the scene. They didn't believe that Mike, who had minimal injuries by comparison, was the real victim. The story didn't add up. The science didn't add up. And the evidence, stacked side by side with each version of events, made the choice clear. After 9 days of testimony, the jury deliberated. It didn't take them long. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, there was a collective exhale. Some cried, some stared blankly. Mike remained expressionless. But the truth had been decided. A man who once seemed untouchable was now a convicted felon. For Sue, it was a moment of bittersweet vindication. She had survived a brutal attack, she had endured public scrutiny, and she had walked into court and told the world exactly what happened, even though her attacker was someone she once loved and trusted. She didn't celebrate, but she could finally begin to feel safe. In interviews after the trial, Sue didn't focus on revenge. She spoke instead about reclaiming her life, about healing, about the scars she'd carry, and the strength it took to stand up in court and say, "He did this to me." The price of the truth. When the jury returned with its guilty verdict, the courtroom was silent. No outbursts, no dramatic reactions, just the quiet weight of finality settling over everyone. Mike Reuschel, a man who once lived behind gates, dressed in tailored suits, and mingled with Florida's elite, was now a convicted felon. But the story wasn't over yet. The final chapter would be written at sentencing.
In December 2019, Mike was back in court. This time, the question wasn't whether he was guilty. That had already been answered. Now, the only question left was how much of his life would he spend behind bars? Prosecutors didn't hold back. They pushed for the maximum. They reminded the judge that Mike hadn't just hurt Sue, he'd nearly killed her. They spoke of the lies he told, the scene he tried to stage, the manipulation he used to make Sue lie in the first place. This wasn't just a man who lost control. This was someone who tried to control everything, right down to the story he wanted the world to believe. Then came Sue. She stood before the judge not as a victim, but as a survivor. Her words were quiet, but they struck like thunder. She spoke of the pain, not just physical, but emotional, of the betrayal, of the fear that still lingered. She said, "He left me there to die." And it wasn't just about that night. It was about the years of being silenced, of feeling powerless, of watching the man she once loved become someone she didn't recognize. The court listened, and then the judge delivered his sentence: 30 years in prison. No parole, no early release, a full 3 decades behind bars. For Mike, who was already in his 60s, it was essentially a life sentence. His days of private jets and family vacations were gone. His future would be lived out in a prison jumpsuit, in a small concrete cell surrounded by the echoes of what he'd done. He didn't flinch. Not when the sentence was read, not when he was handcuffed and led away.
The mask had already cracked, long ago, and what remained was just the shell of the man he once pretended to be. Outside the courtroom, the media waited. Reporters asked Sue what came next. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She was still standing, still breathing, still alive. In the months that followed, Sue began trying to rebuild her life, quietly, out of the spotlight. She finalized the divorce. She sold the house they once shared. She made it clear she wanted no part of the life she had lived with Mike. That chapter was closed. Friends and supporters say she stayed strong, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She wasn't trying to become an icon or a symbol. She just wanted peace. And she wanted people to understand something. No amount of money, success, or charm can hide the truth forever. The scars on her body told one story, but the strength in her voice told another. As for Mike, he remains in state prison, just another inmate in a sea of orange uniforms. He went from a man who once controlled his image down to the finest detail to someone whose fate is now controlled by others. And that's how the story ends. Not with a twist, but with a reckoning. A man who thought he could rewrite reality was finally forced to face it. A woman who was nearly silenced found her voice. And justice, though slow, arrived in full. If stories like this move you, disturb you, or make you want to dig deeper into the human psyche, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. More true crime stories are coming, and you won't want to miss them.